Welcome, everyone, to the WEI Tech Talk podcast. Stay tuned for a conversation about how SOCs evolved, what a modern SOC looks like, the role of a SOC in improving IR, and the proactive nature of threat hunting. We're visiting you today from Startline Brewery in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, with a pale ale in our hands. Cheers, Jeff. Episode topic today is maximizing incident response effectiveness in the modern SOC. My name is Shawn Murphy. I am your host. I am a cybersecurity solutions architect at WEI. We are a value-added reseller based in New England, delivering products and services all over the United States and abroad. My background is in incident response and threat hunting. More recently, I've been working on the tech side, doing endpoint, SIEM, and SOAR implementations. And I have a variety of experiences working with and in SOCs, which, again, we'll probably share some war stories. But my experience pales in comparison to Jeff Cassidy, our special guest of the day. So, Jeff, what are you up to these days?
Thanks, Shawn. Glad to be here. Glad to be having a beer with you guys. So I'm currently working with CyberTrust. CyberTrust is a recently formed nonprofit. We are created through a collaborative initiative across government, corporate, and academia leaders to strengthen the cyber capabilities across municipalities. I've been in the cybersecurity field for over 20 years, mostly focused on SOC and incident response for large global companies with employee and headcount and endpoint counts in the tens to hundreds of thousands. So during that time, I gained significant experience and exposure to sophisticated and advanced adversary tactics, and I've solved complex security problems at scale. So now with CyberTrust, I'm leading the SOC practice and applying that knowledge to serve the cities and towns across the Commonwealth.
CyberTrust's mission, I think, is super important to the state and to WEI in particular. We recognize the importance of labor in security operations. We constantly hear about a shortage of good talent. So I think we think it's very important to make sure that there's a pipeline of talent that our state can benefit from. I was reading on your website before we jumped on the sort of mission statement for CyberTrust is to develop a talent pipeline of skilled, experienced, and diverse candidates, which I think is a really interesting mission. I don't know if you want to say more about those three bullets.
Yeah, so it's recognized there's a cyber talent shortage across just the Commonwealth alone of 20,000 plus jobs. Wow. There's a huge issue with diversity, as I'm assuming you guys know. And a lot of that is because corporate recruiter and retention from large area colleges aren't necessarily focused on colleges with heavy diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, excellent. I know I have experience working in SOCs with different folks that have different perspectives. Maybe they have different backgrounds, or maybe they were raised under different conditions and they just see problems in a different way. And I totally can understand the importance of that in our security operations center. We need all the talent we can get, definitely in terms of quantity, but also in quality and diversity as well.
Yeah, so our view is you can't fix the talent shortage without tapping into the full extent of the population, right? So reaching out to those underserved communities.
Yeah, another bullet that struck me was the experienced bullet. What do you mean by experienced? I've worked with candidates that come right out of school. They have a computer science background. They're really sharp, but that's not quite the same thing as experience, is it?
So getting into cyber and filling this talent shortage requires more than just classroom level learning and education, right? So the mission of CyberTrust here is getting students right out of college graduating with some hands-on real-world work experience, right? Mm-hmm. So we're doing that in two different ways. We have a cyber range facility live at Bridgewater State University, and this range is integrating experiential hands-on learning into the classroom, into the courses, into that curriculum, so the students get real-world live fire exposure.
Super important.
It's fantastic. This range is awesome. You should see it. The second piece that we're doing is providing SOC services that are almost entirely student staffed. So these are interns from all of our member colleges. We've got 8 member colleges throughout the Commonwealth currently. And these students get the opportunity not just to go in the classroom, not just to go to the range, but to get real-world hands-on experience working in a SOC. So when I say the mission of CyberTrust is to secure the municipalities, it's the students that are actually working and delivering that service for us. Obviously augmented by some professional services staff, such as myself, from our partners for EDR and managed EDR from SentinelOne, but the students are participating heavily in that service delivery for us.
Wonderful. Awesome mission. Thanks for sharing a little bit. I know this is one of the reasons why WEI is a corporate partner of CyberTrust, because we totally agree with the mission and see the problem. So we've mentioned the term SOC a couple of times, and I wanted to dig into that because what we're focused on at WEI is modernizing the SOC. So let's understand the history of where SOCs came from and how they're typically organized. I don't know if you want to start with sort of a mission of a SOC. What is their job, high level?
So in short, the goal of a SOC is find the bad. That's probably a very overly simplified definition, but when you think about the security organization in large companies, they're generally staffed with a lot of engineering work, a lot of identity and access management work, that cloud expertise, and they're really augmented by the full depth and breadth of an IT organization that's generally doing the patching, the hardening, responsible for data backup and recovery, and all these things that sort of need to dovetail into detect, prevent, respond, recover, right? So the goal of the SOC is it's the center of operations. So it's going to be the heart and soul of a security organization, pulling in log data from all these disparate sources, combing through it with a very fine-tooth comb, trying to figure out what's going on in the network and is it good or bad.
Right. And we say SOC like it's a center, security operations center. In some cases, it's a physical location where you're sitting in cubicles looking at a big screen. In some cases, it's virtual in nature.
Correct. I view SOC more of a construct of an operating model, just like any other department in a cyber organization. It does help to have some physical locations sometimes to get the big screens up on the wall.
Exactly.
But I don't think that's necessary all the time for a SOC.
SOCs are typically, in my experience, structured with different analyst tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. They have different jobs in the SOC, but typically the tier 1 analysts are focused on initial triage of cases. So they're getting all those alerts. They're getting a lot of the telemetry that you were describing earlier, and they have to decide if something's worth investigating further, and then they escalate it to tier 2.
Yep.
Tier 2 performs an investigation, goes a little deeper, and then tier 3 are sort of your aces. They're the people that come in and they know the infrastructure better than everyone else, and they're able to help make decisions about whether or not those alerts are legitimate.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And then one of the topics that we wanted to circle back to at some point is the way that the SOC works with incident response, or where incident response fits into this. Because I've had some experiences where the SOC is 5 people and they wear many hats. So they put on their incident response hat when there's a live incident, but otherwise they're a tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 analyst, for example.
Historically, these two teams are close to each other but separate. There really needs to be that symbiotic relationship back and forth where there can be a seamless handoff from an alert into incident response. It's interesting that a SOC may include an incident response team or function under that same umbrella, along with other functions that sort of support the SOC. That detection engineering piece, that threat hunt piece, that cyber threat intel piece. So we actually know what we're looking for. We want to know what bad is. And who's building those alerts, who's figuring out what the adversary tactics and techniques are that we're expecting to see.
Yeah, and more managed services are a huge part of the SOC too. I was with a customer last night. I think they have 800 people under their CISO organization. Huge organization, very siloed, lots of different organizations focused on different aspects of SOC, but they outsource all of tier 1 to managed services, and they consider that part of their SOC. It's an extension of their team, essentially.
Yeah, very common model. Most organizations will rely heavily on offshore outsourced MSSP providers for that due to some cost-saving advantages. It also helps with the 24/7 aspect of this, of nights, weekends, holidays. Trying to run a full SOC internally only and manage that shift work can get very cumbersome, and it takes away as a distraction from executing the mission.
Definitely. And you mentioned some other domains. Threat intel has a special place in my heart. I spent a lot of time looking at threat intel when I moved into threat hunting capacities. You mentioned threat hunting, content development. We could spend hours, I think, on each one of those, but focusing more on the SOC and their duties, I get the impression that their responsibilities have grown exponentially. You said that data is sort of the driver of what the SOC does day in, day out. Can you speak to how the mission has changed maybe in the past decade?
So it's growing, right, in both complexity and volume, as well as frequency of alerts or detections going off, right? And a lot of this is due to the expanding attack surface. So we think legacy, back in the day, we had a building, it had a firewall, it might have a data center inside that same building, and you had some departments, and you had just had this box to monitor and manage. So fast forward a couple of years, give or take, we now have cloud, we've got multi-cloud.
Are you trying to avoid dating yourself? Is that?
I am, yes. I think I mentioned earlier, I've been in the field for a few decades, and yes, it has changed in that time significantly, right? So like I said, we now have cloud, we've got multi-cloud, we've got this huge digital presence and footprint. We've got SaaS providers, we've got OT, we've got IoT, we've got all these things that sort of compounds what the SOC needs to have visibility and oversight of to go look for bad. Trying to manage and cover a growing environment with that level of complexity, you obviously have the need for more tools. These very niche, very specific tools that are looking in a specific environment. So you can't use the same tools to go monitor your Azure, your AWS, and your Google Cloud that you're going to use to manage a legacy on-prem physical data center environment.
Or even whole new domains. Like I know when I started, we used to say packets don't lie, and the network was the source of threat hunting. You were looking for interesting network communications, and then it evolved to endpoint. And then cloud became a big focus area. And now I think identity is a huge focus again, because with this distributed perimeter, identity is really your new perimeter. So yeah, there's different domains, and that increases your volume. And there's also increased complexity given complex nature of the networks we're tasked with protecting.
Got more tools, we've got more specialized tools, we've got limited integration and interoperability between these tools. And the solution to date is throw more people at it.
Right.
Working, not to say we have a talent shortage, but we need to make sure that it's the right talent in the right place, doing the right jobs.
Yeah. And on that topic of people and throwing more people at the problem, there's also an issue with burnout, because this job is not particularly exciting. And I know I follow a bunch of cybersecurity subreddits, and I constantly see people like, I've been working in a SOC for 9 months. How do I get out of here? And that's kind of a failure of the whole security team to not provide that person the tool to do their job effectively, right?
Alert fatigue is real. As I mentioned, the more tools you onboard, the more the attack surface you have to cover, the more knowledge that those analysts need to get, but the more volume of alerts that are coming through. So you end up having the need for this real-time closed loop cycle of not just respond to the alert, but tune it as well. So now you've got a skills gap and an expertise knowledge where your tier one who's responding to the alert doesn't necessarily have the knowledge of how to tune that alert for false positives and increase efficacy. So hence the tier two, the tier three for escalation isn't necessarily always just to go escalate a true positive. It's to figure out how to stop that false positive from recurring. So we see closed alerts being escalated to a higher tier for increasing its accuracy.
Yeah, and this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit. I wanted to get to ultimately, what does the modern SOC look like? Like what would it be to be modern? And I know it, just my 2 cents before I get your expert opinion, I don't know if that tiered structure is actually a good thing for the SOC, because the tier one analysts, they burn out quickly because it's high stress, and they don't see other aspects of the security investigation and response pipeline. If there was some way of like shuffling them around or using different tools to make that possible, what do you imagine as like modern, if you could wipe the slate clean?
I think the modernization element is driven by getting away from the legacy historical model of how we got here, right?
Okay.
And it did really come from the old world help desk sort of model of a call comes in, you get the initial personal answers, and they don't know what to do, so they escalate to the next help desk model. The current SOC is operating based on an evolution of that. Although it didn't really evolve, we just copy and pasted the same model forwards. Leveraging offshore or MSSP providers to help with that tier one triage escalation means that you are relying more heavily on higher volume of senior analysts in your triage team. Some potential values of that is they can more dynamically and fluidly move across the alert response into incident response when there is something more significant than just malware or a phishing email that requires some knowledge. Some other issues, I think, of modernizing the SOC is not just getting away from the org structure situation that's holding it back, but some of the technology platform problems that are holding it back. So the SIM, Security Information and Event Management, right? Its job is to pull in log sources from anything on the network you want to be able to see, or your cloud, your identity platform, like you said, your firewalls, your endpoints, your EDR stuff, and to aggregate all of that. And then the idea was to go into that SIM, figure out what in a log would indicate bad, and then that SIM is going to create an alert into a different ticketing platform that the NS is going to look at. That model doesn't scale well. So what we're really looking for is a new SOC platform, something integrated and holistic that not just takes in those logs, but can be used for built-in case management, that can use AI for creating those detections and tuning those detections, for machine learning algorithms to understand what log sources or elements in a log are missing in order to achieve more visibility. So we're trying to figure out how to use technology as a catapult, not just as an anchor.
Couldn't agree more. And I'm really glad the expert said it and I didn't have to say it, so it sounds like a sales pitch. Yeah, I think a platform that's aggregating data from multiple sources, analyzing it well with analytics, and like machine learning, AI is sort of a buzzword, but there is some promise for it doing jobs that traditionally analysts have had to do by hand better and more effectively. And then automation, I think, is a huge component of that too, taking action on things.
Predictable, repeatable response tasks, absolutely.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good point to transition into from that modern SOC vision of having a platform, automation, analytics heavy. How can the SOC improve IR's effectiveness? The SOC has their task of working these alerts and escalating to IR, but maybe we should start first before answering that question about the effectiveness with what's IR's mission, and then how can SOC?
So I think when we look into incident response, it comes down to sort of how the SOC model is to find bad. The goal of incident response is to contain bad and get back to good. So the SOC, for at least a percentage of the incidents that an IR team is responding to, needs to deliver the all visibility of what happened up to the point where an incident was declared. What were we looking for? What did we find? What tools were in play? What was the expected behavior versus the observed behavior? So what doesn't help incident response is coming in halfway into a situation and not having the full history of why this is a thing. Reducing the time that it takes to understand scope, understand what the potential impact is believed to be at that point in time, what systems were already known to be part of the compromise or the incident scenario. The challenge here really for incident responders is time. You don't always have time on your side when something's on fire. So you need to have as much information as you possibly can upfront delivered to you in a very concise, consistent package in order to know what's been done already, what state is the network in, what's the potential for scope and magnitude here. So the incident response team can pick that up, look at it very quickly, figure out next steps, make sure things are contained, go back to look for root cause and make sure they understand the high level view.
Totally see the point about the role of the SOC in enabling IR to execute on their mission, I wanted to go back to a couple things you banged out there. One was the scoping. Scoping is sort of a technical term that we use in incident response. So when you have a sort of thread to pull on, when you have an alert or something that indicates that there may be an intrusion, the scope in my mind is how many systems are involved, how many users or user accounts are involved, what networks are involved. Kind of, I want to get my arms around this entire incident, because when you go to build a remediation plan and contain that threat, if you've missed something, you're going to end up playing whack-a-mole, because you think it'll contain the threat actor, but they'll happen to have a Trojan somewhere else in your environment, and they'll just reestablish a foothold.
I think you're right. I think there's a systems involved element of scoping. I also think there's a timeline element of scope. So if you got an alert for anomalous behavior on an endpoint, is that the initial point of compromise or infection, or is there a timeline that could go back a day, a week, a month, or longer in terms of all the same incidents that's just been gradually escalating to the point we had an observation?
Right.
So there's a time scope on this as well that should be done at the SOC tier before the incident response team can get involved.
Yeah, and going back to what you said about how the SOC is typically structured in the legacy SOC, it's a ticket-based system where they're working an individual alert. They don't see that alert in the broader context of what happened before, what happened after. Are there other alerts of this type that have fired recently? They usually are blind to that. And just a call back to the concept of modern SOC, I think a platform that's aggregating your alerts and looking for commonalities between them can help solve or address that problem.
Orchestration is playing hugely into helping to solve part of that by doing some pre-enrichment for the ticket or alert once it gets generated, in terms of, are there other similar incidents over time? Has this user been involved in other anomalous behavior recently? How often are we seeing this? What's the historical efficacy of this alert? Is it generally false positive or true positive?
Next question I had prepared for you is, are there any trends or patterns you've noticed in your career around how IR teams are structured, or what the people are focused on, or how they work together? Are there any high level words of wisdom you can offer to IR teams about how to get better at their job?
So I think in general, the outside view of what incident responders do is 40 hours a week involved in an incident and something is always burning. Fortunately, that's not exactly the case.
Right.
I would say there's probably a 60-40, 80-20, if you're lucky, sort of divide here on incident response for an IR team versus incident preparedness for an IR team. So what we really want to do is focus on getting more prepared, more rehearsal, more dry runs, right? More of those tabletop simulations, more refined playbooks for exactly how to execute when a certain specific incident happens, more incident response plan coordination. So historically, incident response has been a security issue, an IT issue, a cyber issue. I think as we get better at triaging incidents, responding to incidents that are newsworthy, right? The bigger ones, we start to realize that there's other parallel swim lanes here that need to happen that also need to be rehearsed. This is, when are you notifying your legal counsel that something's going on? Who's coordinating with the media? Who's going to start prepping the IT teams to make sure those backups are immutable and tested? So if you can pull the IT element of their role in security into your IR tabletop simulations and scenarios and practice. So the idea here is train like we fight, right? So you want to get as much under your belt as you can, and making sure that, just like the SOC needs to be predictable and repeatable in their responses, IR team can be to some extent as well. If you start seeing the same type of alert over and over again, you really need to start thinking about how do we get back to root cause. And this turns your IR team into closed loop, back to security, back to IT of, is this something that could have been prevented? So in the same model that a SOC should only be left to respond to something that could not have been prevented, an IR team shouldn't be left to go scope, triage, and respond to impact for something that should have been avoided.
That's a really interesting point you made. I always think of it as the SOC needs to do a better job to enable IR. But what you just said seems to suggest that IR needs to feed their findings back to improve SOC.
As I mentioned earlier, these relationships are bidirectional, symbiotic. Even though they're separate teams, they need to function as one. They need to have that closed loop feedback every time there's an incident. And it's not just IR going back closed loop to a SOC. This is IR going back to IT stakeholders, your cloud engineers, your service providers even, and saying, we keep having this problem with you, why? The SOC model here is less at an external stakeholder level and more of a closed loop with your IT providers. The system keeps getting compromised. Why aren't you patching it? Why do we not run vulnerability scans on it? Why is it obsolete? Why is it running Windows 7? Things to that nature, where we can really start to get better by calling the herd, right? So when you keep having these weaknesses, you don't keep dragging the weaknesses along with you. You cut it loose so the organization gets more secure as a whole.
I know one form of training for incident response is tabletop exercises. Can you explain what a tabletop exercise is and how you are training like you fight when you do a tabletop exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. So tabletops, simulations, mock scenarios, however you want to refer to that. I think there's a lot of ways to deliver that, but it really comes down to creating muscle memory around how you're going to act in a certain situation. So in the time of real fire, you're not wondering what to do next. This becomes second nature. So whether or not that's sitting around the conference room table with a PowerPoint or a scenario, and you're testing out who's your incident commander, who's your incident coordinator, what do you do when they're on vacation? This comes down to who's got an escalation list, and is it accurate? Can you try out those phone numbers? Do you have contacts for all of your key vendors, your key players? Do you have an incident response retainer that you can call in? And if so, who's going to make that phone call? Are they expecting your phone call? Do they have the right information in their portfolio? So when you do call, they already know who you are, what your environment looks like. So there's the simulation side of this that is a piece of the preparation, but it's not all of the preparation. It's not to say just because we do a tabletop once a year, we're good, we're ready, bring on the real incidents. That's not the case. So tabletop exercises should evolve or vary, I guess, in complexity and topics and themes of which of your IT providers need to be engaged and involved, which of your business stakeholders need to be engaged and involved, right? So this isn't just tabletop exercises for the purpose of a SOC or the purpose of IR. This is going to serve to go create awareness and mindset for security is everybody's job across the whole business. So common knowledge, IT can't own data. We have a custodial responsibility to protect it. Security has the same. We implement the controls that protect the data that the business owns. When we start thinking about incident response, it's because your data is at risk of jeopardy of accidental deletion, accidental encryption, accidental exfiltration. Any of these things that shouldn't be occurring is what we want to prepare for. So train like you fight comes down to assume worst, assume breach, and how do you prepare to go to respond to those situations in the real world to have as many of them predicted as possible.
Yeah, you mentioned the concept of stakeholders, and I think that's insanely important because the SOC and IR and threat intel and hunt functions, they all speak the same language. But when you're working an incident, you have to talk to general counsel and you have to talk to business partners that may have to, as you said, report to the media, for example, your marketing department. And all of that is part of the incident response. It's not just the technical incident response.
Exactly right.
And so the tabletop exercises should include all of those stakeholders.
As often as possible. So you want to vary the commitment of your stakeholders of joining in these tabletop scenarios, right? So if you did 1 or 2 or 3 enterprise-wide scenarios on an annual basis, you're getting that message out there. But in SOC and IR, you really want to be rehearsing way more often than that. Less complex situations maybe just involve a business unit or an IT organization in these, and do more targeted, focused upskill and cross-train.
Okay, going back to the time issue and the fact that IR doesn't have unlimited time to do their job, and their job is to scope the incident. Their job is to contain the incident. What's your definition of containment, and how does that tie back to the concept of scoping?
So containment means you understand all the systems that have been impacted or potentially impacted by the current situation. You understand what the business unit is. You understand which third parties are potentially implicated in this. You understand which business lines are going to be disrupted when you start shutting down systems. So there's a fine line between keep the business running and contain to stop the bleeding. You never want to over-contain and say we can contain this entire incident by unplugging the firewall.
Yes, exactly.
You want to contain at a micro level, but that would imply that you need to know exactly what's happened up to that point and have really good confidence that you know all of what's implicated in this.
I remember I worked on an incident response engagement with an organization once where we laid out the situation. You've been owned. Here's what assets have been compromised. Here's what command and control channels look like. And the leader in the room stood up and walked into their data center and just started unplugging network cables. And that's not containment, right? You might actually be destroying evidence or tipping your opponent off in that situation. You might be signaling to them that you know there's an incident and you're panicking. So containment is also about sort of building an effective strategy for removing the adversary, right?
Completely. And understanding your containment means you understand the full scope, and understanding the full scope means you have enough visibility and telemetry across the environment to paint forward the picture of what that attack path played out to be. So there's always the initial access vector. These are usually pretty common. It's user compromise, identity compromise, and host compromise. Those 3 things obviously can happen with different root cause, but there's a need to get back to understand all the activities since that initial point of compromise to figure out what to contain, how to block this, how to isolate it, so you're not shutting things down unnecessarily and causing more harm than good as part of your incident response.
Yeah, and that goes back to another topic I want to just circle back to, which is root cause. And if you don't have root cause, then you don't have good scope, which means you can't effectively contain.
Exactly. And understanding root cause means you have the logs to go back potentially hundreds of days to figure out that initial access vector.
We've spent a bunch of time on SOC and incident response. One of the principles of WEI's cybersecurity practice is this concept of getting left of bang. This is a military term that we've adopted from a book that Patrick Van Horn wrote.
I'm familiar. That's a great book.
It's a great book. I am definitely going to make my daughters read it when they grow up, because I think it'll help them become a little bit more proactive in their day-to-day life. But the concept is really simple. The concept is you should move left of bang. Bang being the situation where shots are fired or a bomb goes off, meaning you should get ahead of the problem. You should be proactive. And I think you said earlier in the conversation, prevention is the best solution. What I wanted to talk about was the idea of threat hunting and how that is sort of a version of getting left of bang, detecting the bang before bang.
Yeah, that's a great point. We see threat hunting as a relatively recent entry into the modern SOC model, right? So we think about how do we want to build a detection? What are we going to go look for? So we start with CTI as the source of truth for who are your adversaries, what are their tactics, what are their techniques, what are their IOCs, are they targeting your industry and your organization or not?
Yeah, and threat
So
modeling being part of that.
that
What are they
threat
after?
model, you're right. So we think about we know a lot about the threat actor groups now of who your adversary is based on the industry that you are. So a mom and pop retail shop doesn't necessarily have the same adversaries as industrial control systems. Way different. One's a nation state, one's opportunistic.
And now geographically speaking, where you're located also matters.
And geographically, geopolitically, there's all sorts of other variables here that help to determine who your adversary is, so you know what you should be on the lookout for. So we can leverage the MITRE ATT&CK framework and sort of map out what these known threat actors are going to try to do to compromise your environment. Generally, they stay the same and consistent for the most part, at least in initial attack means and vectors and the way that they are going to go through recon. You know what to look for. There's certain ones that are more vulnerability exploit versus phishing versus just buying a credential in the dark web because it's cheap. What we want to be able to do is create this seamless workflow from CTI feeding in all that information into a threat hunt team. Threat hunt is going to take that information, that intel, those IOCs, those TTPs, and say, have we seen this historically already in our environment? Is it there? Two outcomes. Number one is we didn't see it, but it's worthwhile looking for proactively going forward. Let's go build an alert for SOC to monitor for.
Yeah, and this goes back to another buzzword bingo phrase, assume breach.
We assume breach. Yes. So the other alternative is we went to this exercise where we hunted for something because as a tactic of our likely adversary, we hoped we didn't find it, but we did.
Yeah.
Now you have an incident, and that's got to go straight into incident response. But it also, at the same time, has to go into your detection engineering team to go build that while IR is running through and saying, scope this, when did it happen, how far back can we go, can we contain it? This comes down to prevention is the best cure. If we know what the adversary tactics and their approaches to compromise your environment are going to be, we know what to block ahead of time, so you can make threat hunt a manageable service offering within your organization without burdening or without overstaffing or overwhelming them by preventing as much as you can up front. You can prevent on firewalls for unnecessary inbound traffic. You can prevent your attack surface on the outside by routine vulnerability scanning, patch management, red team pen testing, etc. So you know what your exploits are, reducing your visibility of what's available. Alternatively, you're going to rely on the SOC to go manage and detect this activity. By then it's too late, and there's already been impact for upwards of 100, 200 plus days, and you're going back in time trying to say, do we have the logs to know what happened?
So the obvious question is, why do you need threat hunt if your CTI team has all these indicators and TTPs? Why don't you just block them? It's more complex than that, right?
It's a lot harder than that. Yeah, that's
Totally.
oversimplified. TTPs are evolving. By the time they get to the point where they're known, the adversary has been using them for weeks.
Right.
You got what I call dwell time, right? So the time when we think the adversary started using this to the time we became aware of when they're using this new tactic, that's the period of time that the threat hunt team needs to go look for. Otherwise, they're just running through how much log data can we go back in, and they're running back 365 days of logs looking for a tactic that just became available last week or 2 weeks ago.
Right.
So the time really is a really important construct and a really important variable here, not just in your IR, but also in your hunt, also in your CTI, also in your SOC practices.
Yeah, time is definitely an important variable. And then also the nature of the IOCs or TTPs. There's this concept of the pyramid of pain, the level of IOC and how easy it is for the attacker to change it. It's very easy for them to rotate IPs, a little bit harder to rotate domains, much harder to rotate how they attack their adversary. If they prefer certain tools and certain techniques, it's very difficult for them to completely scrap those and move to new tools. So you have to focus on those more complex versions of indicators rather than just block an IP and call it a day.
What's interesting here is the concept that your adversary is running like a business.
Mm-hmm.
They have cost committed to developing the methods, the tools, those tactics that they're going to use to come at you with. If their primary motive of initial compromise is vulnerability exploit, they're probably paying significantly for information on the dark web about 0 days. They're investing heavily in R&D into developing a consistent, repeatable exploit for that vulnerability, and they're racing against time, just like the SOC is, in order to deliver that payload against you before a patch is available or compensating controls are put in place.
Yeah, and to go back to the concept of modern SOC, they're using AI, they're using automation to scale their operations and to do that faster so that they can be faster than both our SOCs and incident response teams, but also faster than the vendors that are detecting those vulnerabilities that they're making use of, right?
Absolutely. So AI really is the double-edged sword, right? So it
Yeah.
can be advantageous to be used in the defensive side of the house to develop those detections of what we should be looking for. We can use AI and machine learning to go comb through logs and look for a sort of automated threat hunt capacity, if you will, right? AI can do that fairly well. The flip side of that coin is your adversaries are also using AI. They're using AI to develop more realistic human-like phishing emails with a better tone that doesn't sound so
Obvious.
so obvious, so adversarial, if you will. So it's a race against time. It's this arms race kind of construct that we've always been sort of embracing in the concept of security. So
Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today. I think we had an interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
it's been so much fun. I had such a great time talking with you and recapping the current state of SOC and IR.
And threat hunting.
And threat hunting, yes.
You can find more about WEI at wei.com and
cybertrustmass.org.
there you go. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope we can do this again sometime, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
I look forward to it. Thanks for having us.